Welcome to Grow Your Power, presenting alternative lifestyles that bring personal empowerment. I am your host, Anne Greenfield. Today I am looking into Indigenous connections between American and Siberian Native tribes. What can we learn from them? I will be airing interviews with Amy Lemmer, a local friend of mine, part Choctaw Native woman, who traveled to Siberia to celebrate solstice with Siberian Native tribes. How did Amy ever find herself able to do this? That is a fascinating story in itself and comprises the first interview with Amy. The second interview is the story of Amy's actual adventures in Siberia. Amy Lemmer.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate getting a chance to tell this story.
And can you start, Amy, telling about your Indigenous background?
Yes, thank you for asking. I am a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm Choctaw on my father's side. He came from Oklahoma, and the Choctaws actually originally came from Mississippi and Alabama, and even all the way down into Louisiana was their original territory. And they were removed from those areas during the 1830s on the Trail of Tears, which some people are familiar with from the Cherokees. So there were 5 civilized tribes that were removed at that time. It was the Creeks, the Cherokees, Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. And about 200,000 people were removed, and up to a third of them died along the way. So I'm part of a legacy of people that made it, which makes me very, very grateful to be alive. I mean, I think that's something that we all have in common. We are all descended from the people who made it, because there were times in the past in every lineage that I've looked at where a lot of people didn't make it. So I try and remember that, whenever I'm fussing or complaining about my life, that my life is a gift from the people that didn't give up and kept walking on that Trail of Tears and made it to Oklahoma.
Thank you for sharing that respect for your ancestors.
Yeah. And I think we can all have that. It doesn't matter what color your skin is or, what kind of mix you are. Somebody kept walking.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I wanted to share a little bit about was just the history of the Choctaw people, the ancient history of the Choctaw people, and how that connects with the indigenous people, especially of Siberia, where I'm going. So people are familiar with the Aztecs and how they built monuments, they built stone pyramids, and a lot of people are familiar with that. They had a religion that had to do with the sun and its orientation to the cosmos. So they had solstice ceremonies, equinox ceremonies, and they shared that in common with, many, many people. Well, that religion also went all the way up the Mississippi River Valley. A lot of people don't know this part. So into North America, there were mound builders. So there were lots of ancient people that had centers of culture and commerce and religion that were oriented to the sun, and they had those ancient ceremonies. Now, in North America, they made them out of dirt and not stone because they made them out of what was available. So those didn't have the archaeological resilience of the comparable sites that you see in Mexico. But it was basically a very similar religion. Of course, you can only uncover it as in an archaeological sense and in the stories that are passed down through, through our lineage, which were greatly disrupted by the introduction of European culture and especially European disease. But I find it really fascinating that when you look at all kinds of ancient cultures, you find it similar orientations to the sun and the moon and the cosmos and the seasons, because that's what guided ancient people, especially once they became agriculturalists, which Choctaws were great agriculturalists from way back. They had corn plantations. So I have always been interested in that particular history of my people, and that's the ancient history, pre-colonial contact, pre-Hernando de Soto, who was the first European to really penetrate into Choctaw territory and begin to spread disease that disrupted the culture. So, later Europeans came back much later, hundreds of years later, and that culture had already declined. I find it fascinating when I got invited to this, to come to Siberia to do a solstice festival, which they have every year, the similarity between their beliefs, their cosmic beliefs, and the beliefs in the cosmos and ancient Choctaw culture. So that what really resonated with me and really gave me the impetus to overcome my inertia and go to Siberia, which is no small feat, to get ready for a trip to Siberia and all the unknown of that. So it really pulled up my heart to do that. The thing is that at Fort Ross State Park, there was an incredible multicultural community that arose there in 1812 when the Russians came there. It was the farthest south that the Russians came, and it was a Russian-American company. So very similar to Hudson Bay Company. It was a fur trading company, and they had outposts in Alaska, so they had a lot of contact. On their way over, first they encountered the Choctaw in Siberia, the indigenous people there, and like most empires, they exploited the sable, and there was an inland seal in Lake Baikal there. With the Siberian people, they picked them up on the way and went to Alaska and started doing fur seals. And, they had an impact on the Alaskan culture, especially Kodiak Island and the Aleutian Islands and the Tlingit and the people there of Alaska. And then they wanted to farm wheat because, they were Russians and they wanted wheat and they wanted bread. So they ended up coming down the coast and starting basically a fort that was mostly a ranch and farm that they were using to try and bring agricultural products up to Alaska to feed their outposts. They weren't really colonies because they weren't planning on staying. It was a capitalist adventure, in bringing resources back to Russia, especially furs, because everybody needed fur coats and fur hats, and, it was a big trade item. Unfortunately, it pretty much decimated the fur seal population, and then they started on down the coast and started hunting the sea otters. So sea otters were the big hunting item down at Fort Ross. So those were the two things they were doing. They brought the Alaskans and the Siberians, and they met up with the local Kashaya people who had jurisdiction over that territory at the time in 1812. Now, the Kashaya people have a treaty that was never broken with the Russian, and they just re-honored that treaty recently. So that was a treaty that they had between those two peoples. And one of the incentives for the Kashaya people to have that treaty with the Russians was they wanted to stop the encroachment of the Spanish that were coming up into their, into California and decimating the native populations, enslaving them, and converting them to Catholicism. The Russian Orthodox Church wasn't big into conversion, like they didn't make forced conversion to their religion, although a lot of people in Alaska and even down into California did convert to Orthodox. But that was probably more practical because, you got special benefits if you converted. That is how these different cultures ended up creating this multicultural community at Fort Ross between 1812 and 1840. So it was just this amazing multicultural experiment. So the Coast Miwok women and the Kashaya women often married the Alaskan natives and the Siberian natives and became Creoles. Now, unlike the rest of the country, the Russians that came kept documentation of women and children, which was uncommon at the time. So we had more documentation to find out actually who was there at Fort Ross.
Could you clarify how the Coast Miwok got connected with the other societies there at Fort Ross?
Russians came into the port at Bodega Bay, and so they had a relationship with the Coast Miwok people that were in that area. And then those people were working with the Russians and the Alaskans and the Siberians and the fur sea otter trade. And then they came up, many of those women came up to Fort Ross with their husbands or the people that they were, cohabitating with. And so that's why there were some Coast Miwok and Kashaya people there. But in the record, it looks like there were more Coast Miwok women there than Kashaya women. Mm-hmm. And I want to say that I am just a regular person. I don't have a PhD. I am not California Native. I am just a regular citizen of Sonoma County who got interested in Fort Ross and decided to start volunteering there. And so everything that I'm telling you is from my perspective. I'm not speaking for anyone except for myself. Same with myself as a Choctaw. This is my experience of being Choctaw. Like, everyone has their own take on what it is to be Indigenous and their own personal views about Indigenous culture. So this is just what I have gleaned and learned. So this is how I got involved at Fort Ross. I was looking in the paper when my kids were little for something interesting to do in the summer. And I saw this, this advertisement in probably the Bohemian. And I was like, wow, that looks like fun. And so I got the costume box out. I had done preschool and I had little kids. My sister had 9 kids. Dressed my children up like Russian peasants. And we headed up to Fort Ross for the day. Well, it turned out that Robin had just recently started working there as the interpretive specialist, although she'd been a park aide before. And she was just very excited and enthusiastic, and she was so sweet to us because we had gone to the trouble of attempting to dress up. Now, I was like, looking back, I know that there weren't even any Russian peasants there. I mean, there were very few Russian peasants at Fort Ross.
Were they having cultural festivals at that point?
Yes, it was a Living History Day is what it was called at the time. And I've always loved history. It's just been something I've been interested in, perhaps because I'm Native American and I had to go, hunting around for my actual story because it's, not actually told in the common narrative. So I got interested in history. So anyway, I took my kids up there and we dressed up and made borscht and had fun. And Robin Joy Wellman just invited me into the family, encouraged me to come back and volunteer. Now, it just happened that right around that time in '89 was when the Soviet Union began to collapse. So really what happened in the intervening years after that, in the early 90s, was lots of Russians started coming to Fort Ross. They were coming because it was a touchstone for them in a democratic country, and they could finally travel, and they could come to this place in America. And there was also a reenactment of a flotilla of boats that had come across. It was the 150-year reenactment. And so Russian diplomats even came up. And Robin would call us up because we lived in Camp Meeker, not too far away. Can you come up this weekend and help me? I have Russian diplomats come, I love cooking and I love history. So I was always in the kitchen. And I'm going to share one story because it meant so much to me. It was during this time of this flotilla of boats that was coming over, and there was a coup attempt in Russia at the same time while these people were on this excursion. And there was this potluck that happened. And I'm standing in Fort Ross, which is all built out of redwood. It's this beautiful, Russian-looking, small fort. People were speaking Russian. And we were dressed up in Russian peasant clothes, and we had borscht cooked over an open fire. And then there were tubs of potato salad from Safeway, and there were people speaking English. So it was this amazing mix of history and the present, and this new beginning for the regular people of the Soviet Union who so much wanted to participate in the greater world and are embracing of them. It was this magical moment, which sadly has probably passed. And I was so privileged to be part of that opening and to be there to greet and encourage these people to come and find out about their heritage at Fort Ross. So I kind of call that the Russian era. Like the Russians started coming. Now, when the Soviet Union opened up, we got these documents that for the first time told us who had actually been at the fort. And as an Indigenous woman, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I got this little blue book that there were Native women mostly there cooking. And here I'd been making borscht and pickles, and I'm like, that's probably not what they were making. They were Kashaya and Coast Miwok, Alaska Native women, and they were married to Alaska Native men and Siberian men, and not very many Russians. And I started to rethink, how could I do the kitchen and incorporate Native people into the mix?
Cool.
Now, one of the things that I ran into is that and I knew this because I'm an Indigenous person, is that we have a different relationship to history. So you don't see Native people. It would almost be creepy to dress up like your ancestors. It would not be correct, because the past is still present in Indigenous thinking. This is my understanding of it. So I could see there was a barrier to having these people participate in living history, but I wanted them there telling their own story. So I just started with trying to represent their story by representing their food, and by, we started saying, rather than we were Russians, that we were doing characters that were Native. So we tried. But really, very quickly, the Russians sort of took over. They were so excited about Fort Ross, and they started flooding over, and really the area of living history ended. And it changed to something called cultural heritage. And we did our best to invite Native people, but it didn't really shift until 2012. Now, 2012 was the 200th anniversary of the founding of Fort Ross. Unfortunately, it came on the heels of the Great Recession, so the state didn't have a lot of money. But bless her heart, Robin Joy did her best to, cause this big celebration to happen. And so that was really our opportunity to start to look at how to have the Native people tell their own story. I wanted to also tell this really sweet story. My friend Robin was working together with all these different groups that she wanted to make sure everybody had a voice. The voices compete. So I remember this one meeting we had leading up to the 2012 event, where we were all sitting around this table at a regional park in Petaluma, and the historians who are experts in the Spanish era were there. And the Orthodox Church representative was there. And Vanna was there for the voice of the Kashaya people. And then there was me, and there was Robin, and there was the Russian people. So as we went around the table, I really noticed that everybody wanted to be the hero. Like, nobody wanted to believe that their history was dark. The Russians were sure that they treated the natives better than the Spanish did, and the Spanish said that it wasn't fair that the natives converted voluntarily and tried to whitewash their story. And then the Kashaya were like sure that everybody had just exploited them and didn't admit that anybody maybe went to the fort voluntarily, which I'm sure they did. So anyhow, it was kind of tickled me. I just always remember sitting around the table thinking, wow, all of us want to be the good guys in this story. So how are we ever going to get this story told? But I wanted people to have an opportunity to tell their story their way. I think that that's only fair, and especially the Indigenous people, who often their story is completely buried because it's usually not very pretty and nobody wants to admit that they were exploited. And one of the things that happened was I met this woman, Billy Reen Panola, and I met her at the Russian consulate during this time when we were getting ready for this big 2012 festival. She's Kashaya and from, wonderful family of dancers. And I asked her if she would be in the kitchen with me for 2012. Now, this is a big deal because the Kashaya people didn't come into the fort. They weren't welcome in the fort when the Russians owned the fort, and they mostly lived outside. They had a village outside the fort. So they were reluctant to come into the fort. I wanted to say that the Kashaya people have been involved at Fort Ross over the years. It's not like they only became involved in 2012. But they participated mostly at the visitor center and with the museum and with something that was called the FRIA, which was Friends of Fort Ross. But Billy Reen agreed to come into the kitchen. And like I said, I just thought this was so sweet because it's not really a real Indigenous thing to do, to dress up like people from the past. And yet she came into the kitchen and brought her family in. And, I was in charge of the kitchen, and I brought in a chef that specialized in Native cuisine. I brought in my nephew, who was a chef, who's Native American, who's Choctaw. So it really meant a lot to me that Billy Reen agreed to come and just represent her people. So she brought seaweed and she brought some baskets, and, for one of the first times we had, Kashaya people representing Kashaya culture. And it was just this one tiny little opening. And then from there, things really shifted. And once the Kashaya people got involved, and we took a trip to Russia. So this was all in 2012. We have this big festival in the summer, which is July. And then in September, a delegation of local people and Kashaya people went with Robin over to the Kunstkammer Museum, which is a, very old imperial museum in Russia that had a whole collection of Native artifacts. So I was so honored to get invited to go to that trip. I mean, what a chance in a lifetime. And it sort of, that began to open the door. So when we got back from that trip, then there were other trips. This group of Kashaya, they now have a dance ground outside of the fort that they tend, and the Panolas do. And this is controversial, even their own tribe, because in each tribe, we have different competing belief systems and, what protocol is correct. But at least they're telling their story in their place, because that place was called Matini before it was Fort Ross, and it was their territory. And it's there, for 10,000 years, those people lived there. More than 10,000 years, but at least 10,000 years, which is like when there were mastodons still wandering the planet. So we're talking about ancient ties to that place, way, way, way before anybody else landed there. So that, that is why I wanted, when you put it in that context, like, why wouldn't they be getting to tell their story? Then, the Coast Miwok spends a lot of their people live there. We wanted them to tell their story. And then once the Kashaya invited the Coast Miwoks and they invited the Alaskans, then the Alaskans came and started to participate in a greater and greater way. Now there's a Matini Day where, that's for the native people, California natives that have their day. And there's an Alaskan Native Day. And this year, the Alaskan natives invited the Siberians. So there were Siberian traditional singers at Alaskan Native Day. And it's just, there's just I'm gonna cry. It's the explosion of participation of people telling their story in the way that's appropriate for them in this place. I don't know. I just too have wandered into that place and been even one tiny piece of holding that vision over time and having the privilege to watch it unfold, in all its human messiness. Was just an honor of a lifetime. And
I really appreciate the passion that you have for this whole community of people.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, in the Native community, there can be so much. I imagine everywhere there can just be so much competition for the narrative, and especially in disrupted cultures that are trying to revitalize. And so I just really have an appreciation for the complicated nature of the telling the stories. But I still held on to that commitment and that vision. So when I got invited to go to Siberia by some of the Choctaw people who had come over here and done a solstice festival right at Gualala, because they had ancestors who died on this land, so they came here to honor those people and to put up a ser pole, which is like their sacred pole. I got the honor of going to that ceremony, then to be invited to go to Siberia, to their own homeland, and participate in something that could be traced to a belief system of my own indigenous ancestry. The honoring of the sun, of the solstice, of the renewal of growth, the fertility of the earth itself. It was beyond what I could have ever expected.
Thank you for such a personal story about all this, Amy. And I think we're going to hear from you after you come back from Siberia.
I would definitely love to come back and tell you what it was like. I'm just going on faith. And I have all my considerations. Like I said, I'm just a regular person. I have, like everybody, I have fibromyalgia and 57 years old. My knees hurt. I'm overweight, I got no PhD. So I'm just going to take my, wonderful, average human being, loving, committed self and go represent all of us regular people.
Right on. And I hope that everyone becomes inspired by Amy's passion and what has come of it.
Oh, yes. Like, whatever it is you are passionate about, just go out and do it. Just commit to something. I mean, I had no idea how I was going to pull this off. I just said yes.
July 2019, Amy Lemmer traveled to Siberia for the Siberian Indigenous Solstice Festival. She traveled with Robin J. Wellman, the interpretive specialist at Fort Ross State Park for almost 30 years, and also two Coast Miwok women, Joan and Nancy. They have returned, and Amy is here to tell us what the trip was like.
my first impression was that when I got off the plane in this tiny little airport, compared to like LAX or something, it's a very small airport, and I got off and there was a coffee shop. And I got to have a nice cup of espresso at the coffee shop. So that was my first impression. I was like, oh, I made it. And they have good coffee. So just a little something familiar is amazing when you're in a situation where so much is unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. So first off, we went to Irkutsk, which is just above Mongolia. It's not very far from the Mongolian border, and it's on a lake called Lake Baikal, which is the sacred lake. It's even bigger than Lake Tahoe, and in some ways similar. It's very deep, and it's sacred to the people that live there. And so we were in Irkutsk, which is a fairly large city, and in the 1800s it was a city where there were a lot of merchants and a lot of companies there, because the Russians came there in the 1600s from Western European Russia over into Siberia. So that's the connection to Irkutsk. And Fort Ross was that some of the companies were founded there, or their companies operated out of Irkutsk. So we went there first at the host of a club called the Fort Ross Club. There's a group of Siberian people interested in the history and keeping the history alive, especially the history of the merchants, and stayed in the home of regular families that had us there. After we spent a week with the good people in Irkutsk, and including I got to go swimming in Lake Baikal, which impressed people because it was only 41 degrees. It was very, very cold. But I just felt that I needed to enter my body into that body of water because it's a sacred lake. So that was probably the high point for me of being in Irkutsk. And then we flew to Yakutsk, which is, like I said, farther north. And there we were hosted by the Choctaw people, who were in the middle of making preparations for their very large solstice festival. So they have a really big solstice festival there in Yakutsk. But before that, on the actual solstice, all the little villages all around there have their own small solstice festivals on the actual solstice. So we were on our way right after getting off the plane and sleeping for about 3 hours. We got up and packed for a excursion, which is what they call it, into a village where they were getting ready to have their solstice festival. We were told that we were the first Americans to have visited that village, so they were really excited for us to come. Unfortunately, we got a late start, and there was rain, which had been kind of disruptive. So in Siberia, they travel mostly in the winter when everything is frozen. They drive on frozen roads. It's harder to navigate in the summer because if you get rain, you get mud because the roads are dirt. Because of the permafrost, they don't make permanent asphalt roads as much there. So that's just a little tidbit. So we went on a 5 hour plus dirt road ride, very fast because we were running late, trying to get to this village on the night of the solstice. In the end, we didn't make it. It got dark and it started to rain and the roads got muddy and became impassable. And we found ourselves in a monastery where we spent the night. And it had a village site there that they had set up that was an ancient village site. And we wandered out in the dark and the mist on a very rainy and beautiful night with thunder and lightning and light rain and mist into this village. It was like walking back in time on the night of the solstice. And we went to what's called a serg pole, which is their sacred pole that they put up. And we prayed there. There were 4 of us that were out in that village that night, all alone with the spirits. And I think that was another highlight, was just, having not been able to make it to the actual village that night, it was pretty magical to be in that space. So we prayed and we were our best selves, and then we woke up in the morning and very human and trying to work to get ourselves out to the village. And it had the rain had let up, so we were able to get to the village. They were really excited to have us, and they were having all of their all the things that Indigenous people have that hallmark their culture. So they have their dances, their special symbols, which are like, there's a swan and a crane dance, and there's a feeding of the fire, and there's this beautiful dance that they do. We're all wearing long white robes, and we were hosted to watch all of this, to participate in it. Just so honored to be in a small village and, just be treated so beautifully. And that day I wore my Choctaw dress and all of my regalia from my Choctaw culture in order to create that connection and honor them. The mayor of that village is a woman, very powerful woman, and she spoke so beautifully and with such power. And of course I didn't know what she was saying because she was speaking in Sakha. But I stood up after her and I spoke with as much power as I could about the importance of returning our relationship to the sun, protecting Mother Earth, and that we needed to all stand together to preserve the world and to honor our sacred mother. The woman who was translating for me, she was a beautiful person, but she was not a professional translator, but I told her just to try and say what she knew was coming from my heart rather than to repeat my words. And they stood up and they clapped and they cheered. So I must have hit the mark because there was just this moment where we're all in this together.
I feel touched just hearing
Thank you.
the message that you put out.
Yeah. So that was probably the greatest moment in that small village and probably the most intimate moment of the trip. Yeah, I found it really fascinating in, finding out about the Serg poles that they put up in their big solstice festival, which they have the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and the relationship to the equinox and the celestial bodies in their religion, because that's true of my history, Choctaw history as well. I mean, imagine everybody's history eventually goes back to looking up to the heavens, and especially agriculturalists had to be aware of the seasons, and even hunter-gatherers had to be aware of the seasons. So if we reach far back enough, all of us find this relationship to the sun and the moon.
I think it's kind of amazing to be in a totally different country and to see the same moon.
Oh, yeah.
And the same sun.
Yeah. And the same desire to preserve our traditions and the same desire to save the earth. We all seem to know that it's, it's rocky. At least all Indigenous people that I meet, and most people seem to know that we're in urgent need of taking care of this beautiful planet that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even out in the far-flung village of Marilla and Siberia. We toured the village, and the mayor took us to their school. And of course, she's a woman, and that impressed me. Like, one of the things she wanted to share with us was the elementary school and the work that they're doing with their people there, language programs for them. She was just so proud. How wonderful to have an Indigenous Siberian woman mayor. She also took us to the home of some of the villagers, and they treated us to wonderful food and showed us they're on very small farms. Like they have their own cows and their own horses and their own milking barns, and they have ice, of course, permafrost there, so not very many feet down in the ground, everything is frozen. So the heat, it's very hot there. People think it's cold, but in the summer it's very hot and humid because there's water. So you're like walking on a big warm sponge. And then just down, not that far is this frozen ground that's increasingly melting, as we know. And so they have these ice houses, and they go down into the ground, and they come up with these big hunks of, this beautiful pure ice, and that's what they drink. And they were impressively healthy. I mean, they live a very rural lifestyle that's, what many of us in Sonoma County aspire to. So That was just really a treat. All homemade food and food that they had grown. They have a short growing season, but they have greenhouses and gardens.
Does their food differ from ours in some ways?
Yes and no. They have fermented milk there, the mare's milk, and they have a fermented cow's milk. So it's kind of like a cross between our yogurt and kombucha. That's just really an amazing treat, and I drank a lot of it, everything that I could get my hands on, every time it was served, because, you know, it helped with I never had any stomach problems when I was there, which often happens when you're traveling. Mm-hmm. So, you know, they have that knowledge of the need for probiotics without, you know, having that name for it. They have lots of berries in the fall, but we were there a little early for berries, but they have a lot of jam that they make themselves. They have all kinds of interesting berries there, so. And mushrooms, they're big into mushroom hunting in the fall, and they eat a lot of fish. They have a little indigenous fish, and they're pretty dry, and it's just standard, you know, everywhere we went. Wheat's the main carbohydrate. I mean, if you know, that's like where wheat came from, was Asia and the Middle East. And so they had little pancakes and little waffles. They were always on the table, these little pancakes and little waffles, but they ate them savory. Not, you know, you didn't put jam and syrup on them. They were eaten like bread. And then they have some Russian style food, so they had pierogies. Traditional food was interesting because, like all traditional foods, it's a mix of modern and ancient. And so I could really see the foods that were on the table that came from a time before refrigeration. Of course, they only have a short season where that matters, because mostly it's completely frozen and they don't have to worry about keeping food cold, which of course we were like hypersensitive to because we're Americans and we live in a more temperate climate. So we were like really concerned with, they weren't refrigerating the food, but they seemed to be unconcerned. So I noticed that a lot of the foods were cooked to be very dry. You know, they cooked it to be preserved. And so the meat was kind of like a jerky. Same with the fish. So I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, all the modern stuff. They had bowls of candy and, you know. They grow a lot of their own stuff for their own region. The Soviet system's been gone for 30 years, and there were it used to be dairy country, but that was all subsidized, so there were a lot of abandoned dairies. So there were lots of herds of horses and cows that are personally owned now. So they seem to say they had a strong local dairy industry, but not an international distribution anymore. Because it's not commercially viable. So that's a transition that's been hard for the villages, and a lot of them are in decline because of that, was what I was told. But as far as living there, they have their own cows, their own horses, their own pigs, their own chickens, their own gardens, you know.
Nice.
And they supply themselves. Of course, they're losing a lot of their young people to the cities because it's just more convenient, easier, and there's more jobs and less mosquitoes.
What kind of homes do the indigenous people live in there?
In Yakuts, they have, like many Russian traditions, they have something called a dasha, which is like your summer house where you grow your vegetables and you have your gardens. They're like summer homes. Lots of people have those. In the villages, the houses are, they're just stick-built houses, very modest little village houses, central heat. I guess what I could go on to say is that after spending some time in the village, when we head back to Yakuts, it's the Sakha Republic. That Sakha is the indigenous name, and then Yakuts is the Russian name. And so when we went back there for the large festival, We went to a special blessing. William is the man who is, he's very much a part of the large solstice festival, and I'm talking large, 150, 200,000 people.
Whoa.
All the villages come together for this big festival in this big permanent festival grounds. And so William did a special blessing just for us to prepare us for the large festival. He told us a little history of this ceremony. Of course, they had to work to keep it alive during the Soviet era when those things were not encouraged. Religious practices weren't encouraged and shamanism wasn't encouraged. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was very much a revival in those activities. The day we went to the large festival, we dressed down. I didn't wear my traditional Choctaw outfit, but I wore my jewelry, all my jewelry and regalia, and we were all dressed to go to the fair, basically, like, you're going to the Sonoma County Fair. And we got there, and sure enough, it was like a giant fair. There was this huge grounds, and there was a large arena where they were doing the main dancing and ceremonies. And there are lots of horses. Horses are a big part of their culture. The poles are actually, the sacred poles are where you hook your horses up. That's where you tie your horses to. So that's very, very sacred to them, the horses are. And so we get out there, and I'm walking around, I'm like, wow, it looks like the state fair. It looks like the Choctaw Nation Fair, which in Oklahoma is as big as their state fair. And it has Ferris wheels, and sure enough, they had Ferris wheels, and they had fair rides, and they had cotton candy, and they had popcorn popping, and they had cheap Chinese tchotchkes for the kids, and it just like blew my mind, And they had a whole, agenda, like a brochure that had what was happening, at each time of day. And
Very professional.
Very professional. Yeah, very modern. They set a Guinness Book of World Records for the largest circle dance ever. We just pulled it together, the four of us, and presented our country and our state and Sonoma County as best we could from our hearts. And, we were there with a delegation of people from China who were all dressed in suits and had like a presentation. But we're Californians, so we just took a deep breath, and my friend Robin stood up and spoke directly from her heart about the love that we have for one another as citizens, and how citizen diplomacy is the most important thing, and that we love one another, and that we want to keep peace in the world. Whew, so I was really proud to be part of that.
So wonderful. I was interested in your mentioning a circle dance, a large circle dance, and I wonder if you got to see that at that festival, and if you could describe that dance a little bit.
Well, first off, when I was in the village, we did the dance. It's a dance. We have a similar dance in Choctaw where you go in a circle and you step, one step backward and then one step over, one step back. So it's a common, dance move for group dancing. So we did that at that festival, and then it was repeated, at the large festival. They had a large group of people. I didn't step into that dance circle, but the other people that I was with did, and they went all the way around the circle. So they did that all day. I mean, they did it periodically, so it was ongoing. You could step in at any time.
And was there music to it?
Yeah, yeah, chanting, drumming and chanting. Totally familiar.
Any other instruments?
At the large festival, there was modern versions of ancient singing. So they'd use a mouth harp. Is one of the main things. If you look up Sakaa music, there's some beautiful music that they have that's modern. So they have it sounds kind of like trance music. They make sounds like horses using a mouth harp. And it sounds almost like electronic music, but it's just one guy with a mouth harp. Pop songs that are in Sakaa that are, traditional, made into pop songs. So, I mean,
it's such a treat to hear just how different things can be in another country. It fascinates me.
Yeah, well, and how similar, what's different and what's similar is the most surprising, I think. And the things and also how much we crave the familiar while longing for the exotic. It's a human phenomenon, I find. One of the things I walked away with was just how much our romantic notion that sometimes exists about Indigenous people. What I really left with was, we're all in this together. They're facing a lot of the same things we are. They've got, cheap plastic junk they're trying to figure out what to do with in these villages, right? That's infiltrated their world, like at the fair. And they, their kids want to live in town. And I could really understand after spending time out in the village, like, hippie as I think of myself, I wanted a regular bed with sheets and a toilet that was familiar, roads that worked, and traffic rules, and just,
I understand.
And a regular job. And then, you want to go back to the village. Like, you have that craving for village life. I feel that pull back and forth there just like I feel it here. And then also how, in a modern world, how are we going to preserve our earth and preserve its health and preserve our health? And they're same thing that they're looking at. For example, when we went to the big festival, I was like, wow, the mosquitoes weren't that bad, because Siberian mosquitoes are legendary. I don't know if you know, but they're legendary. They're very large, and they're like, oh, yeah, that's because we sprayed. And then some of the traditions that they probably used in the past that have been lost, that before there was spray. I just really get that we're all struggling with this together from one end of the earth to the other. We all got to pull together. That's really what I walked away with. We all need to pull together. There's nobody out there with a magic answer.
I appreciate your perspective.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder how the Indigenous folk there relate to the larger government, which I guess is Siberia an independent nation?
Well, it's a republic. It's a Russian republic.
Okay.
So they have the Russian Federation. And we didn't talk a lot about that. Their indigenous heritage is everywhere. So, on the sides of buildings, there's indigenous symbolism and murals. There's, like, if you see an ad, it's not a white Russian in the ad. It's a Siberian, Asian-looking person in the ad. Their culture is very present in their big city. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah.
I know that what I heard a lot was that they are not happy with the intrusion they feel of Chinese culture. Just like any modern culture, there's this economic disparities between countries. So new Chinese wealth is able to come into Siberia and buy property, and they don't like that. Another last capper of the trip, like one of the last things that we did just before we got ready to go, was we went to a place called Lena Pillars, which is also a very sacred place. We took a boat and drove for miles looking at these giant geologic features and petroglyphs, and that was just such a beautiful and relaxing way to end our trip. And I did go in the water there. Like, I wanted to go swimming. Everybody else hiked very high up these stairs. And then this one Russian lady, she looks at me and nods, and then she disappears. And she comes back with a bottle of vodka, 2 glasses, 2 towels, and her swimsuit. I'd like to go to Cahokia, which is right here in the United States, where they do a solstice celebration there. And it's just a gathering of people who are there to recreate the solstice rituals from the ancient mound builder time.
Do you know about the Siberian indigenous folk, when they actually were first in Siberia?
Well, I know that they were, same as here, they were there when the mastodons were still walking the planet. We met a lot of carvers and artists because the carvers were the ones that came over to Fort Ross in the 1800s, carvers and hunters, and they built Fort Ross. So they were master carvers, and there was one that was very highly regarded, Sakaw carver at Fort Ross, that's documented. So we met with the carvers who came over here in 2014 and carved the ceremonial poles that are at Walala State Park. Master carvers of Yakuts are very well regarded, and they do ice sculptures, and they've won awards all around the world. I mean, these are award-winning sculptors that we got to meet there, and they carve out of mastodon bones because mastodon tusks just, churn up out of the permafrost. So we got to see all this carving out of mastodon ivory.
I like hearing about the creativity and resourcefulness that people show when they are in different environments.
Yes.
I mean, having permafrost under your feet all the time,
Right.
Soggy permafrost, muddy roads, lots of winter.
Yes.
It seems very intriguing.
The message that I took home was it's time for us to look back up into the sky and not down into the ground. So I could see that oil comes from out of the ground, but originally it came from the sun. We've lost our sacred relationship to the sun. We stopped looking up for our energy. And I'd really just like us to return to honoring the dynamic relationship between the sun and the earth and the water and the air.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Amy Lemmer, thank you so much for being here and going there.
Yes, thank you for caring. Thank you for doing this show for me so that I could share this. I mean, you experience something, and then there's this desire to share with others and re-experience it yourself, because it's almost like a dream. I noticed as soon as I got home, it started to evaporate, just like when you wake up for a dream, and I always wanted to capture it. And the way to capture it for me is to share it with other people. Mm-hmm. So thanks for the opportunity.
All right.
Okay, thank you.